I'm Dr. Allan Charles of USC at Union, and I'm going to give a presentation on the U.S. Constitution in remembrance of the establishment of this document, and this is going to be especially for Constitution Day, which will be on the 17th of September, coming up here. Anyway, the U.S. Constitution is probably the greatest single governmental document ever put together by a group in the history of the world. It is an amazing document. It grew out of some controversial times, and we still are in controversial times today. But let us see how these people came up with this particular document and what this document means to the United States, and we think perhaps other people in the world also today. The United States was founded by 1783 when our independence from the British Empire was recognized by the British. And the independence was gained by 13 independent states, from Massachusetts and New Hampshire in the north all the way down to South Carolina and Georgia in the south. We had a total of 13 states, and they were states. They were independent political entities. There was nobody over them telling them what to do. The only government that had done that was the London government of the British Empire, and we had broken off from that. And so what were these 13 independent states going to do? Well, they were going to have to come up with some sort of system, and during the Revolution itself, they came up with a thing called the Articles of Confederation, in which these independent states agreed to work together to get the job done for independence. And after we gained independence, they were still independent states, and they were going to try to figure out individually what needed to be done. And basically, most of them didn't like much of anybody from outside telling them what to do. And as the 1780s wore on, after 1783, it looked as if the independent states might have been too independent. And so there were people who wanted to have a tighter system, a system which would make it easier to trade from one part of the colonies, ex-colonies, to another, to be able to form a common defense a lot more easily, and to minimize conflicts between the individual 13 states. And these people were motivated by a group of people led by George Washington. George Washington was a very large tobacco planter in the independent state, virtually country, of Virginia. And he had been a general during the war that we had just fought, the American Revolution. He had been a general. But then he decided that, well, the war was over, he didn't have anybody to fight anymore, so he went home to his plantation of Mount Vernon. And he continued, however, to agitate for a stronger system of government. The system of government that we had was, to his mind, inadequate, and we needed a tighter system. And so he got some talks going in 1785 between Virginia and Maryland over some common problems that they had. He had these people over to his plantation to talk about things, and they agreed that we might have an even bigger talk. And so we got together various of these independent states in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, to talk about getting a stronger system up. And they didn't come up with a particular document, but they said, well, we need to get everybody together in 1787 and see if we can really come up with something that's a workable solution to what they saw were the problems of too loose a government in the United States. It was called the United States, but it was under our original Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation. And so they got together they wanted to get together in Philadelphia in 1787. And so they asked the U.S. Congress, which was then in the capital of the United States, which at that time was New York City, to authorize them to do this. And they said, well, we will give you an authorization. And the authorization that we will give you is limited. You can talk about amending the Constitution we do have, which is the Articles of Confederation. So what you can do is propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And they said, well, okay, if that's the only thing we can get, we'll take that. The Congress of the United States was then, as we said, meeting in New York City. And in the Congress of the United States, it was where the representatives of all 13 states would gather. And every state had a vote, because it was a club, if you will, with 13 members. And each state had a vote. South Carolina had a vote. Virginia, which had a lot more people, had a vote. New York had a vote. Massachusetts had a vote. And you could send as many people as you wanted to Congress, but you only got a vote. And so the Congress did vote to allow this meeting to happen. And so in due course, in 1787, they got together in Philadelphia, and they met at Independence Hall. They deliberately chose Independence Hall because that was where the Declaration of Independence had been signed way back in 1776. We remember the Declaration in 1776. And a lot of people think that everything we've got today grew out of 1776. Well, no, it did not. In fact, there were only 8 men who had signed the Declaration of Independence who were present at the Constitutional Convention. Only 8 of them were there. This was basically a new crowd, a new group of men. All of these were white men. Many of them were slave owners, and they didn't have anything about minority rights or anything about including women or including minorities or various things like that. All of this is things that were thought of subsequently by later generations. And so these men who got together wanted to have a document that would establish a system that was capable of being amended. They knew if they came up with some ironclad system that he might get it to work for a year or two, but sooner or later there'd be some kinks that would emerge, and the whole thing would have to be thrown out. And so they made it subject to amendment, made it difficult to amend it, but it was definitely possible to amend it, and it has been amended quite a few times, as we know. Well, they got together with some of the bigwigs there were, of course, George Washington himself. If he had boycotted it, if he had not wanted this, he could have stayed home in Mount Vernon and written letters to the editors of newspapers saying, let's not do this. And if he had done that, it wouldn't have happened. If he'd been opposed to it, it wouldn't have happened. And furthermore, he not only could not be opposed to it, he had to be in favor of it. And he was elected president of the convention, president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And he sat on a raised platform behind a desk, and he presided over everything. He didn't really participate too much in the nitty-gritty of hammering out the details of the Constitution, but his presence was necessary for this thing to happen in the first place. And he was unanimously, as far as I recall, elected president of the convention. Other members there, people we know already, were Benjamin Franklin, who had been present and did sign the Declaration of Independence, also in that hall. And it was no accident that they chose that hall, because it had such memories for Americans, because that's where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And so it would be nice if you could have this new document come out of the same building where the Declaration of Independence came from. They were very mindful of that and wanted to make sure that that they had the legitimacy that a document coming out of Independence Hall could convey. Another person there was James Madison. He has been called the father of the Constitution. It bears his imprint more than any other single person. He actually had more input, if we want to use that word, into the document than any other one man. Alexander Hamilton was there. He has been remembered with a very successful Broadway play in his honor that's named after him anyway, called Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was a centralist. He wanted all of the 13 states, independent individual states, to give up any idea of independence and to have a new central government that had all the power. This was not going to happen, and he knew it was not going to happen, but he wanted to make it as tight and strong and centralized a government as he possibly could get. Some of the people were in favor of a much looser system. Rhode Island was suspicious of the whole endeavor and never did send any delegates to Philadelphia to the Constitutional Convention. So the convention only was composed of 12 states, not 13. Rhode Island boycotted the whole thing from beginning to end and refused even to send a single delegate down there. Some states were not represented the entire time because the delegates were off tending to business, and there might not have been any delegates from that state left for a period of time. But over most of the summer of 1787, which was a fairly hot summer by the standards of the time, most of the 12 states had at least one person there representing, one man representing that particular state. They were all educated men. They had been classically trained. And a classical education in those days meant that a student was brought up to know the histories of Greece and Rome and the modern histories of France and Spain and Britain and so forth. So they knew a lot about history, and they knew a lot about governments in the past. And they knew that the Roman Republic had an unwritten constitution, and it was the Roman Republic was run by a Senate, and they admired that so much that they actually named one of the two houses of the United States legislature the Senate. The Senate had a good deal of power, but it couldn't really hold things together, and was not malleable enough to be able to handle an expanding Rome and a strong man arose, Julius Caesar, and they established the Roman Empire. And a series of strong men were able to keep it going for the Roman Empire going for almost 500 years, which is a pretty long time. But the only trouble was they didn't always have a peaceful transfer of power. And sometimes the people to whom power was, the guy to whom power was transferred was a very strange person, and perhaps even somebody who was not even completely sane. We don't need to get into any of the details about that, but there are all kinds of, we had some pretty weird Roman emperors, Caligula, Nero, some of these people, and some of them didn't really have both oars in the water, unfortunately. And so they had a problem. They had to have a man at the helm who could keep everything together but not be a dictator at the same time. And so he had to serve for a limited time. They had to be able to figure out how to have elections for this person. They had to be able to figure out what you're going to do to limit the person's power while he was in office. And so you were going to have a separation of powers here between the branches of government. And they had some documents to go on. There was John Locke. They had his ideas of how things should be set up. They had other people that they had read, books that they had read that gave them some ideas of what things should be done. And so they were trying to steer a middle course between having too much power to the constituent portions of this new republic they were going to establish, and between the central power that ran the whole thing. They were trying to run a compromise between those two positions. Well, they said that, well, what we do need to do is to have the three separate branches of government represented by three separate individual branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And they agreed, well, yeah, we should do that, have three branches of government, all individually set up. And there would be a constant push and pull among the three branches, which would keep any one branch from becoming dictatorial. And the executive branch would be subject to the branch of the legislature, the legislative branch. So the legislative branch was to be the most powerful one, and it was discussed in Article 1, first article in the new Constitution that they were writing down. And they were writing that down, and they said, well, what kind of a legislature are we going to have? And in Rome, they had only had a single legislature of the Senate. And they said, well, Britain has got two. It has the Parliament composed of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And we will have a Senate as our House of Lords, and then we will have the House of Representatives as our House of Commons. And everybody said, well, that's not bad. That's a pretty good idea there. And then they said, well, okay, now how are we going to apportion representatives to these two houses that we're going to have? And here is where people started getting upset with each other. The large states, led by Virginia, said that, well, both houses ought to be in terms of the population. And so they said, well, we'll have a smaller house, an upper house, the Senate, based on population, and a lower house, the House of Representatives, also based on population. The small states said, now, wait a minute, that's not really the way we would like it to go. We would like to have one house where every state has the same representation. And Virginia said they would never do that. And so the whole meeting almost broke up over this issue as to just how many people should, how you're going to represent the states in this new legislature that they're going to come up with. And a compromise was finally reached between the Virginia plan, which said let's do it on population, and the New Jersey plan, which was the small state plan, which said that, well, we should do it on equal votes for the states. Every state should have one vote, let's say, in the Senate, and 2 votes or 3 votes or whatever in the House. We have the House is going to be bigger. But they should have equal representation. In fact, we might just dispense with the bicameral thing, the 2-house thing, and we'll say we'll just have one house, and we'll call it whatever you want, the Senate, the House, or whatever, and we'll have one thing, and it'll be called the Senate, let's say, and every state would have the same number of votes, 2 votes for every state, say. In case one of them is sick, the other one will be there. And so you have to have, let's say 2 from every state, let's say. Or you could say 3, but it wouldn't matter, but it's going to be the same. And the Virginians said, no way we're going to do that. And finally, they reached a compromise. This was called the Great Compromise, in which they said that what we'll do is we'll have equal representation in the Senate, 2 votes from every state, and we will have proportionate representation in the House. And this will be, you will get so many votes for the size of your state. And we're going to have to, of course, know how many people are in the state in order for this to happen. We don't have to know for the Senate because it's the same number of people, but we will need to know for the House. And they said, okay, well, we're going to have a census. And so they said, okay, what we'll do is we will establish a federal census bureau, and the federal government will go around counting all the people in all of the states, and a state will get a representative for every X number of votes, every X number of people that you've got. And if you've got 3X in another state, they'll get 3 times what the 1X state gets, and so forth. It'll be proportionate. And they agreed on that and said, okay, they got over that hurdle, which had almost broken up the entire gathering that they had there. The next problem they had was the executive. And they said, okay, we're going to have a strong executive. The executive has to be strong, but the executive should be able to be removed by the legislature, and if push comes to shove, because we don't want the legislature being removed by the executive, the president. And they said, well, okay, we'll do that. And so they put in the impeachment process. We won't go into the details of it here, but they put in a system whereby the legislative branch, should it be down on the executive, can actually remove that person or any other federal person holding a position of trust. Any other person with a position of trust can be removed. So that machinery was put in there. So you see they put in the machinery then for counting everybody, and then the machinery for removing the executive, should it be considered necessary. And then they had a judiciary, excuse me. They had the third branch, the least important branch, was to be the judiciary branch. And it was to consist of a Supreme Court, one Supreme Court, and such lower courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. And so it didn't set up a system of courts. It just said you'd have one Supreme Court, which you have to have. Later on, when the new Congress met under this Constitution, it set up a system of lower federal courts. And those are the courts, the federal courts that we have today. But those were established, the lower ones were established by federal law. The Constitution itself only said that, well, we're going to have a Supreme Court. And they didn't even say exactly how many people are supposed to be on the Supreme Court. We have settled in the last 150 years basically on 9, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says you absolutely have to have 9 people in there for this to happen. They had a problem about slavery. Some of the northern states were not happy about slavery, and and Massachusetts, in fact, was eliminating slavery at the time that the Constitutional Convention was being held, and other northern states were about to follow suit, and so there were some people at the convention who said, well, let's put into the convention that we will eliminate slavery. And the southern states sort of cleared their throats, and the guys from the southern states, from Maryland south, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, said that, well, we're not going to talk about eliminating slavery. Someday that could happen. That is entirely a possibility, but we're not going to build the machinery to eliminate it into this document. And they said that if you are going to say that slavery is going to be ruled out, then we're out of here. And the southern states said, we're going to pack up our briefcases and go home. If you do not only allow slavery, but actually protect it by this document. You actually have to protect slavery. And so protections for slavery were written into the Constitution from the very beginning. And the northern states acceded to that. They did this in order to keep the South from breaking away. The South, in fact, wouldn't have had to secede from the Union. There wouldn't have been any Civil War. There wouldn't have been any problem like we had with Abraham Lincoln 7 years later and all this. That wouldn't have happened. The South would just have gone home, and then the northern states could have gotten together and formed a United States of North America from the Mason-Dixon line up on their own. But they wanted the southern states in. And because of that, they said, well, all right, we will allow slavery, but we were not going to let you count the slaves as persons when we're considering how many people you got in a state. And the southern states said, well, we are going to count them too. And so they haggled about that. And finally, they came up with the 3/5 compromise, which said that you can take the sum total of slaves in any given state and take 3/5 of that number, 60% we would say today, and you can add that total to the number of people in that state for figuring out how many House members you're going to get from that state. The South wanted to count all of the slaves. The North, a lot of northern states wanted to count none, but they did settle on 3/5, and so the South came out ahead, 60%, and did that. Some people have said, well, these slaves were only 3/5 of a man. Well, the South wanted to count the slaves as 100% of a man, 100% of a person. It was the Northerners who in fact, argued them down to only 3/5 or 60%, in order to keep the South from having an unduly large number of representatives in the House of Representatives. This was the Northerners who wanted to do that. Otherwise, the South had, in fact, over half the population in most southern states was composed of slaves. And so the South, if it counted none of them, would have about half or less of the representatives in the House that they would have if you counted the slaves. And they counted women who didn't vote, they counted slaves who didn't vote, they counted a lot of people who didn't vote. And in fact, the white a lot of white men couldn't vote either. You had to own property in order to be able to vote in any one of the 13 states. The states said that in order to vote, not only did you have to be free, white, and 21, but you also had to own property. You had to be free, white, male, and 21, and own property in order to vote. And they put in an amendment procedure to the Constitution that said that, well, you can amend the Constitution, but in order for that to happen, you have got to have 2/3 of the states say they want it to happen, or 2/3 of the Congress, both House and Senate, say they want it to happen. And then that will be a proposal of an amendment. And then it has to go to the states again to ratify this amendment. And it takes 3/4 of them. 3/4, the legislatures in 3/4 of the states will have to agree that the amendment should go in. And then it will go in at that time. This will be a very, pretty difficult thing to do. It would be possible to amend it, and it has been done, but it will take quite an effort for this to happen. This left the amendment process in the hands of the states. The states can propose an amendment X, doesn't matter what, as long as you've got 2/3 of them, and then the states can ratify it as long as you have 3/4 of them. And technically, they can amend the federal government out of existence and say that Washington, D.C. will be a living museum, and turn the White House and the Capitol building into museum buildings, and there will be no federal government. It could be technically amended out of existence by the actions of the states by themselves. Thank you very much. Turn the camera down, and that's an off button there.